Some mornings arrive without sunlight. They come instead with the quiet hum of machines, the soft shuffle of rubber saws in a hallway, and the faint scent of disinfectant that clings to everything. Your clothes, your sheets, even your memories. That was the morning I woke up in a nursing home. But the heavier truth, the one that still settles on my chest even now, is that my family never woke up to see me. I remember opening my eyes slowly, the way a man does when he's not sure whether he's waking from a long dream or entering one. The ceiling above me was plain, off-white, unfamiliar. Not the cream-colored one from the bedroom I painted with my own hands. Not the ceiling I once stared at beside my wife, Ruth, while we whispered about our children, our bills, our hopes. This ceiling belonged to another life, a life I hadn't agreed to, a life that arrived quietly while I wasn't looking. I tried to sit up, but my body answered with a stiffness that felt older than my years. My right shoulder throbbed, remnants of the stroke that began this whole journey, and my legs felt like they were borrowed from a stranger who hadn't taken care of them the way I once had. A soft ache traveled through me, settling deep in my bones, reminding me that this wasn't home. A nurse, a young woman with gentle eyes and a voice that floated like a melody, stepped into the room and smiled. Her badge said Elena, and she spoke to me as though we were old friends. "Good morning, Mr. Smith. Did you sleep all right?" I nodded because it felt easier than telling the truth. I didn't sleep. I drifted. I listened to the quiet. I followed the faint echoes of memories that pulled me back to the days when waking up meant something different. When mornings were filled with purpose, with tasks, with the simple joy of brewing coffee for two. I looked toward the door, half expecting someone to walk through. My daughter, maybe. Or my son. Or even a neighbor who remembered I once helped him fix a fence. But no one came. Just the soft squeak of the nurse's shoes, and the sound of her replacing the water in the little plastic pitcher by my bed. "It's your first morning here," she said kindly. "You have physical therapy at 10. And your breakfast will be here shortly." I thanked her. It felt strange, thanking a stranger for what my family used to do without me asking. When she left, the silence grew taller. It stood over the room like a shadow. I shifted my gaze to the small window where sunlight finally began to filter in. I noticed the trees outside, bare branches, winter clinging to them stubbornly. I used to love winter. The coziness. The stillness. The way Ruth would knit by the fireplace, humming an old tune that had no name. But winter feels different when you're inside a room that isn't yours. I reached for my glasses on the side table, and my hand brushed against something cold. My wedding ring. I had taken it off the night before when they helped me into clean clothes. I held it between my fingers, running my thumb along the smooth metal the way I once traced the back of Ruth's hand. She's been gone 8 years now, but sometimes grief doesn't age. It stays young and sharp. I slipped the ring back on, letting the familiar weight settle around my finger. Somehow it reminded me that I had lived a life before this place. A full one. A loud one. A life where my name meant something to someone. Breakfast came, a tray with oatmeal, a banana, and a cup of warm tea. I stared at it for a moment, realizing something so simple, yet so heavy. This was the first meal I had eaten alone in more than 50 years. Even after Ruth passed, my daughter would check in every morning. My son would call from out of state. Neighbors would knock. I was never alone. Not like this. I took a few bites, though they tasted like nothing. Hospital food tastes like survival, not living. Around 9:30, I asked the nurse if my daughter had called. She checked the chart. "Not yet, but I'm sure she will." I nodded. Because what else do you do? You cling to the stories you've written in your mind, even when reality edits the ending. The physical therapist arrived, a tall man with a warm handshake. He helped me stand, and my legs trembled as though they were meeting the floor for the first time. We walked slowly, my feet shuffling, my hand gripping the walker. Each step felt like an apology, to my younger self, to the man who once lifted furniture on his own, who built a treehouse for his kids, who carried his wife across the threshold all those decades ago. When therapy ended, I was wheeled back to my room. On the way, I passed a door with a handwritten sign taped to it. "Do not forget, Jerry loves flowers." Inside, an old man sat staring at a bouquet on his table. At least he had someone to remind the world of what he loved. Back in my room, I asked again if anyone had called. "No calls yet," the receptionist said kindly. "But the afternoon is still young." Young. The word felt foreign now. I spent the afternoon staring at the clock on the wall. I don't know why clocks in nursing homes tick so loudly. Maybe to remind us that time still moves, even when our lives feel like they've stopped. 2 o'clock. 3 o'clock. 4. Every time footsteps approached, I lifted my head. Every time they faded into someone else's room, I let it fall again. By sunset, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet ache settling in the places where hope used to live. My daughter didn't come. My son didn't call. No one asked the nurse how I was settling in, whether I needed anything, whether I felt scared, lonely, or lost. For the first time in my life, I felt truly placed somewhere. But like an old sweater folded away and forgotten in a drawer. As night approached, the hallway lights dimmed, and the world outside my window turned the color of ashes. I lay back on the bed, listening to the faint echoes of televisions from other rooms, the laughter of sitcoms, the buzz of game shows, sounds of people pretending they weren't lonely. I closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come. Only memories. Memories of birthdays where laughter spilled out of the house. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper everywhere. Little feet running down hallways. Small hands tugging at my shirt. My children once looked at me as though I were the whole world. Now they couldn't spare a minute to look at me at all. A soft knock came at the door and Elena peeked inside. "Mr. Smith, do you need anything before I head out?" I wanted to say, yes. I need to be remembered. But instead I shook my head slowly. She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the small lamp beside me glowing warm and golden. "Good night," she whispered. Her voice carried more kindness than my own blood had shown me in months. When she left, the silence returned, heavier, deeper, more honest than any words I could speak. I stared at the doorway long after she was gone. Not because I expected my family to walk through it, but because I was realizing they weren't coming. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Maybe not at all. The truth settled over me like a thin blanket, warm enough to acknowledge but not warm enough to comfort. And in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day Ruth died. I felt forgotten. I felt small. I felt alone. The night stretched on like an endless hallway, each hour marked only by the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant clatter of a cart being rolled somewhere down the corridor. I lay there, hands folded on my chest, staring at the faint glow of the lamp beside me. For a moment, I imagined it was the glow of the old lamp Ruth used to keep on her bedside table, the one with the frayed shade and the warm amber light that softened every wrinkle on her face. Funny how the mind will reach for warmth even when the world around you has gone cold. I turned slowly, wincing as the ache in my hip reminded me once again of the years that had settled into my bones. There was a picture frame on the small table beside my bed. A gift from my daughter. Though, to be honest, she had given it to me years ago, long before this place became part of my story. It held a photograph of my family taken during a long-ago summer vacation. My children grinning wide with ice cream dripping down their fingers, Ruth leaning into me with her head on my shoulder, and me smiling like a man who believed life would stay that way forever. I held the picture in my hands. My fingers traced the outlines of faces that once crowded my days with noise, affection, and nearness. The glass was cool against my skin, but the memories were warm, too warm. Warm enough to burn. As I stared at that frozen moment, a question crept into me, slow and painful. When did I stop being part of my own family's picture? Not the photograph, but the real living picture. The one that continues even when you're not in the room. I had given them everything I had. Not without mistakes. No father escapes that fate, but I showed up. I worked long hours, missed very few school plays, taught my son to shave, taught my daughter to drive, and sat at the edge of my bed with Ruth every night, talking quietly about how we hoped the kids always knew how deeply we loved them. But life is strange. People grow. People drift. And sometimes love becomes something we assume is understood rather than something we show. I put the picture back down, careful as though the past might shatter if I moved too quickly. Sleep came eventually, but it wasn't the kind of sleep that rests a man. It was thin, restless, interrupted by the nurse's rounds and my own thoughts, which tugged at me like children trying to get my attention. Morning came again, slow, hesitant. Light crept through the blinds in quiet stripes, painting the room in pale gold. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, listening to the sound of someone down the hall coughing deeply, a sound that carried age, weariness, and too many years of holding back tears. A breakfast tray appeared at my door shortly after. Oatmeal again. Tea again. Routine begins quickly in places like this. The nurse asked how I slept. I gave the same answer. A nod. A small smile. Polite lies are easier than opening old wounds. After she left, I found myself staring at the doorway once more. Waiting. Hoping. Wondering if today would be different. My daughter had promised, months earlier, to visit as soon as I was settled. I remember her exact words. "Dad, once you're there, I'll come by every Sunday." I promise. Promises are strange things. They mean everything when they're spoken, and almost nothing when they're forgotten. 10 o'clock came. Therapy again. I gripped the walker with hands that once chopped wood, once fixed engines, once lifted my children high into the air without hesitation. Now they trembled with the weight of my own body. Each step felt like a question. Each breath felt like an apology. And each pause, those quiet moments between movements, felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. When therapy ended, I asked the receptionist again if anyone had called. She shook her head gently. "I'll let you know right away if they do." Her voice was kind, but her eyes carried the kind of sympathy people keep in their back pockets when they're used to saying the same thing to 100 forgotten souls. Back in my room, I spent the next hour looking out the window. The world outside kept moving, cars passing, birds drifting from tree to tree, a couple walking their dog. Life continued with or without my participation. At noon, I heard laughter from the room next door, someone's grandson perhaps. His voice was young, bright, alive. It sliced through the wall and landed in my chest like a blade of envy I didn't want to acknowledge. I wanted that. Just a voice. A reminder that I still mattered to someone. I closed my eyes. The boy's laughter faded. The quiet returned. And I sat there, wondering how a man could live a full life and still end up feeling like an afterthought. By late afternoon, I decided to take a slow walk down the hallway. The staff encouraged movement, even if it was just to the common room and back. I shuffled along, walker in hand, passing door after door. Some open. Some closed. Some decorated with photos, drawings, cards. Others bare as though the person inside had no one left to remember them. Halfway down the hall, I saw an elderly woman sitting by the window, her hands resting in her lap. She looked at me and offered a small smile. Not a cheerful one, just a gentle acknowledgement. A shared understanding. Two strangers who knew the same kind of quiet. I nodded back. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed the staff had put up a bulletin board with upcoming events. Bingo night, movie night, Tuesday sing-along, Friday book club. Activities meant to keep people busy, engaged, distracted from the missing pieces in their lives. I stood there for a long time, reading each announcement slowly, my eyes lingering on the one that said, Family Day, Visitors Welcome. It was scheduled for next month. I whispered a quiet hope into the air, an old instinct. Maybe they'll come by then. It wasn't a prayer. Just a sentence spoken to no one in particular. A thread of hope I couldn't bear to cut completely. I turned back toward my room, moving slowly, feeling the weight of the walker and the weight of everything I'd never expected at this stage of life. When I reached my door, I stopped. There was no one waiting inside. No familiar voice calling my name. Just the silence again, steady, predictable, loyal. I stepped in and closed the door behind me. The click of it echoed louder than I expected, like a period at the end of a sentence I didn't want to finish. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, letting the quiet settle around me like dust. There's a peculiar kind of silence in nursing homes, thicker than the quiet of a house at night, heavier than the hush of a hospital room. It's the sound of unsaid words, unfinished stories, and people waiting for footsteps that rarely come. My hands rested on my knees, trembling slightly. I wasn't cold. I wasn't weak. I was waiting. Waiting for a familiar voice. Waiting for the door to open. Waiting to be seen by people who once couldn't take their eyes off me. The hours dripped by, slow and syrup thick. I picked up the old landline phone on the bedside table, staring at it like it might magically ring if I looked hard enough. My daughter used to call me every day, even if only to say she was running late or that the kids were sick or that she'd bring groceries by after work. My son used to send pictures of his dog, selfies from the hiking trail, little moments he wanted to share. But days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. And eventually into excuses. Dad, work is overwhelming. Dad, the kids have soccer. Dad, flights are expensive. Dad, you'll understand. And I did understand. But understanding doesn't fill an empty room. It doesn't warm a cold evening. And it doesn't answer a phone that never rings. A knock came at my door that afternoon. My heart jumped foolishly. Unreasonably. I tried to calm myself before turning around. It was Elena. Mr. Smith, she said softly, stepping inside. We're having music hour in the recreation room. Would you like to join us? I looked at her, her kindness, her patience, and something inside me wanted to accept, if only because being near another person felt like salvation. But the truth was, I didn't want to sit in a circle with strangers and pretend we weren't all quietly hurting. Maybe tomorrow, I said. She didn't push. She simply nodded, understanding the things I couldn't say aloud. After she left, I lay back on the bed and let my eyes wander around the room. Sterile walls, framed art that meant nothing to me, Beige curtains that could have belonged to any window in any building in any city. Nothing in that room told my story. Nothing said, James Smith lived a life here. Maybe that's what stung the most. Feeling like my life had condensed into this single room with a single bed and a single drawer where my few belongings lay like artifacts from a forgotten museum. Around dinner time, the hallway lights flickered on again, bright and too white. A tray was brought in. Chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans lined up in a neat row like little obedient soldiers. I ate slowly, tasting more loneliness than food. The sun dipped low outside my window, turning the sky a dusky orange. I watched the colors fade, feeling the minutes slip with them. And then, I don't know why, I whispered into the dim room. I miss my family. Saying it out loud cut something open inside me. The words trembled in the air for a moment before dissolving into the silence. I pushed the tray aside and reached for my walker. My legs groaned in protest, but I ignored them. I needed to move. I needed to feel something other than this stillness. I shuffled toward the hallway and headed left, where the common room glowed softly with the light of a television playing an old movie, one of those black and white classics Ruth used to love. A dozen residents sat scattered throughout the room, each in their own quiet universe. One woman knitted with slow, careful hands. A man tapped his foot nervously, staring at the door as though expecting someone. Another woman held a stuffed cat in her lap and stroked it gently, whispering to it as if it were alive. I sat in an armchair tucked against the wall. No one noticed me, but I didn't mind. The presence of others, even strangers, felt like a balm on the raw edges of my loneliness. The movie played on, the characters dancing and laughing, reminding me of a world that had existed long before any of us entered this place. I watched the scenes blur past. Young love, big dreams, promises whispered in the dark. It reminded me so much of my youth that I felt something tighten in my throat. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the soundtrack of the film, light, hopeful, nostalgic. And when I opened them, a memory washed over me so vividly it almost felt cruel. I saw Ruth dancing in the living room, spinning slowly in her bare feet, her hair cascading over her shoulders. I had stood there once, leaning against the doorway, watching her with a smile that felt too big for my own face. You look beautiful, I had said. She turned to me, laughing softly. Then come dance with me, James. And I did. I danced with her as though the world were made just for the two of us. A warmth spread through my chest at the memory, but it was followed by an ache so deep I had to steady my breath. I would have given anything, to dance with her one more time. A soft voice pulled me back to the present. Do you want a blanket, sweetheart? An older nurse asked. I shook my head gently. No, thank you. She smiled, patting my shoulder before walking to another resident. That small gesture, that simple human touch, it brought a sting of tears to my eyes. I wasn't used to kindness anymore. Not the kind you can feel on your skin. When the movie ended, people shuffled back to their rooms, some with help, some alone. I followed slowly, each step echoing louder than the last in the now quiet hallway. Back in my room, I sat on the bed again, breath heavy, heart heavier. I stared at the empty chair beside my bed, the one they placed there for visitors. It remained untouched. Unused. Unnecessary. That chair had become a symbol now. A reminder. A truth I didn't want to admit. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and whispered into the stillness. Is this what the end looks like? A room, a chair, and no one left to fill it? The silence didn't answer. It never does. But sometimes silence is the most honest companion of all. The night grew long again, but I didn't lie down right away. I stayed seated on the edge of the bed, staring at that empty chair until my eyes blurred. It's strange how an object, just wood and fabric, can hold so much meaning. That chair wasn't simply a piece of furniture. It was an invitation. A hope. A place reserved for someone who might still care. But it stayed empty. Eventually, I eased myself back under the blankets. My body felt heavy, as though the weight of years had settled on me all at once. I turned off the lamp and the room slipped into darkness, soft and quiet, the kind of darkness that doesn't frighten you but instead presses gently against your heart, reminding you of everything you've lost. I closed my eyes and without meaning to, I started counting the breaths. There was a time when I'd lie awake beside Ruth, listening to her breathing. It was a rhythm I took for granted, steady, warm, comforting. If I close my eyes now, I can still hear it. Sometimes I pretend she's in the room with me, that if I reach out my hand, I'll touch hers. But when I do reach, there's only cool air. I drifted into sleep eventually, the kind that feels like falling. Slow, reluctant, lonely. Morning crept in again, brushing the walls with pale light. I blinked up at the ceiling, stretching my fingers slightly to test the stiffness in my hands. Another day. Another room. Another quiet beginning. There was a knock, followed by the door opening just enough for Elena to slip inside. "Good morning, Mr. Smith," she said in that soft voice of hers. "Did you rest?" I nodded. It was easier than explaining the truth of my nights. She opened the blinds and sunlight filled the room. Almost too bright. I squinted against it. Strange how light can feel intrusive when you're not used to being seen. "Your daughter called yesterday," she said suddenly. My heart paused, truly paused. I sat up straighter without thinking. She said she'd try to come this weekend. The words "try to" echoed louder than the promise itself. Try. But I smiled anyway because hope, even fragile hope, is heavy in a place like this. You take it in small doses even when it feels forced. "That's good," I murmured. Elena gave me that kind look again, the one that made me feel less alone for a moment. Then she left to check on the others. I stared at the doorway long after she disappeared. Maybe this weekend. Maybe things would feel different. After breakfast, they wheeled me to a small lounge for a group activity. Something about memory games designed to engage cognitive function. I went because the days felt long enough without resisting everything they offered. There were 4 of us in the room, our chairs arranged in a little half-circle. A staff member held up old photographs, black and white scenes from the 1950s and 60s, and asked if any of us remembered the times they came from. One picture showed a family at a picnic, children dancing through a field with kites in their hands. Another showed a couple standing beside an old Chevrolet, smiling at each other as though nothing in the world could ever change. When the staff member held up a picture of a young father holding a newborn in his arms, something inside me cracked. Just a small, invisible fracture. I remembered the day my daughter was born. The way she curled her tiny fingers around mine. The way my world shifted in an instant. I remembered the day my son came home from school with his first scraped knee and insisted he didn't cry, even though I could see the tear stains on his cheeks. I remembered the nights I carried them both to bed after they fell asleep watching movies. The weight of them in my arms. Their heads resting on my shoulder. Their small breaths on my neck. I remembered everything. Too much sometimes. When the activity ended and they rolled me back to my room, I felt the loneliness sharpening again. Not because the others weren't good company, they were. But being around people who were also waiting only reminded me of my own waiting. Back in my room, I looked at the little calendar pinned to the wall. I circled Saturday, the day my daughter said she'd try to visit. And then the strangest thing happened. For the first time since arriving here, I felt anticipation. A fragile kind. The kind that made my chest feel both light and tight at the same time. But as the days crept closer, I found myself tidying my room, the same way I once cleaned the house before company arrived. I folded my extra sweater, straightened the stack of magazines, even brushed my thinning hair with more care than usual. Saturday morning arrived, clear and crisp. I woke early, watching the light shift across the room as nurses moved in soft patterns outside my door. I had asked Elena to help me put on the blue shirt my daughter bought me for Father's Day 2 years ago. She smiled as she buttoned the collar. "You look handsome," she said. I chuckled, but the truth was I felt nervous. Like a young man waiting for a date to show up. I sat in the chair by the window, the good chair, the one meant for visitors. I kept that spot empty all week, saving it for her. But today I sat there, hoping the symbolism might draw her closer somehow. Hours passed. At 10:30 I checked my watch. At 11 I told myself she was on her way. At noon I convinced myself she was stuck in traffic. At 1 I told myself she probably stopped to pick something up. At 2 I told myself she'd walk in any minute. By 3 the truth settled in. She wasn't coming. Again. The ache in my chest felt sharp. Sharper than age, sharper than illness. More like betrayal wearing the disguise of disappointment. Elena came in quietly at some point, carrying fresh linens. She saw me sitting there, still dressed for company, hands folded, eyes tired. "Mr. Smith?" she whispered. I forced a smile. "Maybe next week." She hesitated, then placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I didn't have the strength to pretend anymore. Not for her. Not for myself. When she left, I leaned back in the chair and let out a trembling breath. It's a strange grief, mourning people who are still alive. The sun was sinking by then, turning the room into a soft blue. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, like a man fading quietly into the background of his own life. As I watched the sky darken, one thought rose through me like a tide I couldn't hold back. I'm still here. Why does it feel like the world forgot? The next morning, I awoke with a heaviness I couldn't quite swallow. Not the ache of old bones. Not the familiar stiffness in my legs. Something deeper. Something that settled behind my ribs like a stone. The kind of heaviness that comes from hope denied too many times. I sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint rustle of nurses beginning their rounds. Doors opening. Doors closing. Wheelchairs moving softly across linoleum. The calm rhythm of a place built around waiting. I wasn't angry at my daughter. I want to make that clear. It wasn't anger that hollowed me out. It was the realization that the people we love most can drift so far away we can no longer tell if we're standing still or if they're simply walking faster than we can keep up. I reached for my cup of tea, my fingers curling slowly around the handle. The warmth spread into my palms, gentle, familiar, grounding. Tea has a way of making even loneliness feel a little more bearable. As I sipped, I wondered if I had somehow failed my children. Did I not teach them enough tenderness? Did I not show them how to stay close? Did they see old age as a burden, something that happened to me instead of something they too would one day face? Ruth used to say, "James, love is loud when children are small. But when they're grown, love becomes quiet. And sometimes it becomes distant." She was right. But she never warned me that distance could ache like this. Around mid-morning, I asked Elena if there was any mail. She checked, shook her head, gave that small apologetic smile I'd come to recognize. "No mail today. But I'll check again tomorrow." Tomorrow. Such a hopeful word for something so uncertain. After breakfast, I rolled myself toward the window. Outside, the world looked almost peaceful. Birds picking at the ground beneath the trees, a dog walker braving the cold, kids in bright jackets racing each other along the sidewalk. So much movement. So much life. And there I was, sitting behind glass, watching a world that no longer needed me. It's a quiet kind of heartbreak, realizing life moves on without checking if you're following. I spent a long time looking at the street, imagining my daughter's car pulling in. Imagining her stepping out, brushing her hair behind her ear the way she always did. Imagining her walking through the doors, her eyes searching for me the way she used to search for me in crowded rooms when she was little. But imagination is a soft lie. And the truth always waits patiently beneath it. A soft knock came at my partially open door, and an older gentleman rolled his wheelchair inside. He was thin, with white hair that seemed to rise in little tufts, as if it were always trying to escape the top of his head. "You're the new one," he said with a slow grin. "Mind if I sit a while?" I gestured to the extra chair, the one meant for family, not strangers. But today I figured maybe it didn't matter. He eased into it with the kind of sigh only an old man can make. "Name's Harold," he said. "But most folks here call me Hal." "James?" I replied. He nodded. "Yeah, I heard." I wasn't sure what that meant. Maybe news travels fast here. Maybe the staff mentioned something. Or maybe he simply recognized the look of a man still learning the shape of his loneliness. "I saw you waiting yesterday," Hal said softly. My throat tightened. "Hoping, actually." He nodded slowly, eyes lowered. "We all start that way. Waiting for someone to walk through that door." I swallowed hard, feeling something warm and painful build behind my eyes. "You waiting for anyone?" He leaned back in the chair, hands folded loosely in his lap. "Used to. My daughter came once a month for a while. Then it turned into holidays. Then only Christmas. Then," he shrugged. "Life happens. People drift." I looked at him, really looked at him. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a tired acceptance. Like someone who had already traveled the road I was just stepping onto. "Does it get easier?" I asked. Hal gave a small, sad smile. "No," he said gently. "But you get stronger. Or maybe you just learn to let go of expecting too much." I nodded slowly, the truth of his words settling over me like a second blanket. He talked for a while, about the Navy, about his late wife, about the way the seasons feel different when you're old. I listened. Not because I was interested necessarily, but because it felt good to have another voice filling the empty corners of my room. Before leaving, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone here, James. You may feel it, but you're not." After he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the seat he'd just occupied. The same seat I'd been saving for my own children. The irony wasn't lost on me. Later that afternoon, I forced myself to participate in one of the activities, the painting hour. They set out little canvases and cups of water and cheap brushes that frayed at the edges. I didn't know what to paint. My hands weren't steady anymore, and I felt foolish holding the brush as though I were a schoolboy again. But something inside me stirred. A memory. A moment. A small warm flicker. I dipped the brush into the blue paint and began to move my hands slowly across the canvas. A sky. Then a horizon. then a silhouette of two people holding hands. When I finished, I sat back and realized what I'd painted. It was Ruth and me, standing together the way we once did on our back porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. My throat tightened. The past has a way of painting itself onto your present, even when your hands shake. As I stared at the little painting, a single tear rolled down my cheek. Not from sadness. Not entirely. But from the bittersweet truth that love, real love, never disappears. It just becomes quieter. When painting hour ended, the staff collected the brushes, but they let us keep our canvases. I held mine carefully in my lap as they wheeled me back to my room. It felt fragile, not the canvas but the moment. A small reminder that some parts of me were still alive, still capable of creating, still capable of remembering. I placed the painting on the table beside my bed, leaning it gently against the lamp. The soft glow illuminated the tiny figures, just two shadows holding hands under a painted sky. I traced them with my eyes and for a moment the room felt less empty. Later, as the afternoon sunlight thinned into a pale, tired gold, I decided to take a slow walk, if it could be called that, to the garden outside. The nurses kept it well tended. Narrow pathways, small benches, winter plants arranged neatly, as if trying to remind us that things still grow even in cold seasons. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp. It tasted clean. Honest. I breathed in deeply, letting the cold settle in my lungs. A small breeze rustled the dry grass, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined myself in my old backyard, where Ruth used to hang laundry on the line, humming songs that never had lyrics. I shuffled toward a wooden bench and lowered myself onto it with effort. My joints complained, but my heart welcomed the stillness. A staff member had placed a small bird feeder nearby, and a few sparrows hopped along the ground, pecking at the seeds. Funny creatures, birds. They always find a way to keep going. Even in winter. Even when the world grows quiet. I sat there watching them, and my thoughts drifted, slow, tender, painful, to the years when silence wasn't my constant companion. I remembered family dinners where the house roared with conversation. Ruth passing plates around with her warm smile. My daughter talking about school projects. My son asking if I could check the tires on his bike later. The clinking of forks. The cough of laughter. Life happening all around me. And here I was now, an old man on a bench in a nursing home courtyard, watching sparrows nibble at seeds. Life changes quietly. We don't feel the shift until we're already standing in a different season. A voice interrupted my thoughts, gentle, cautious. Mind if I join you? I turned to see Hal rolling his wheelchair toward me. His smile was small but genuine. Not at all, I said. He parked beside the bench, rubbing his hands together to warm them. Cold out today. But it's good for the bones, or so they tell me. I chuckled softly. Feels like everything's good for the bones except being old. Hal laughed, a rough, breathy sound. Ain't that the truth? We sat there in comfortable silence. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, companionship. Not the kind that fills the room with noise or excitement, but the simple, reassuring presence of someone who understands your language without you having to speak. After a while, Hal cleared his throat. Your daughter. She might come next week. Don't give up on that yet. His tone was gentle but not pitying. Just honest. I'm not giving up, I said. And that was true. I wasn't giving up. I was just adjusting the size of my expectations. That's good, Hal said. Just don't let waiting become the only thing you do. His words struck me in a place I didn't know was still tender. Before I could respond, a nurse called for us to come in. It was getting colder and the evenings could be unforgiving. As they helped us inside, I glanced one last time at the empty bench beside me. For the first time, I noticed its shadow stretching long across the ground. Like a companion. Like a quiet reminder. Back in my room, I changed into my nightshirt and sat in the same chair I'd saved for my daughter. This time, I didn't save it for anyone. I sat in it because I deserved to occupy the spaces I once reserved for others. The room glowed softly with the warm light of the lamp. My painting soaked up the glow, making the little silhouettes look almost alive, almost moving. I reached for the photo of my family again, not to ache over it but to remember that those moments were real. That the love we shared was real. Even if the present felt empty. I looked at Ruth's face in the photo, her eyes bright, her smile effortless, and spoke into the quiet. I'm doing my best, sweetheart, I whispered. I'm trying to make peace with all of this. It wasn't an admission of defeat. It was a promise to myself. I set the photo back and rested my head against the chair. The days that followed fell into a slow rhythm. Therapy in the mornings. Meals that tasted the same. Short walks. Quiet afternoons. Longer nights. No phone calls. No visitors. But something inside me began to shift, not in a sudden dramatic way but in the quiet, subtle way seasons change. One afternoon, Elena came in with a small folded paper in her hand. "Mr. Smith," she said softly, "some of the residents are writing little notes for a community bulletin board, things they want to share or advice or memories. Would you like to write something?" I looked at her, surprised. "No one wants advice from an old man," I said gently. She smiled. "You'd be amazed." After she left, leaving the paper and a pen on the table, I sat there staring at it. What could I possibly write? What wisdom did I have left? What truth could I offer, without bitterness, without regret? I thought for a long time. Hours maybe. And then, slowly I began to write. Love people while they're within reach. Life takes them farther than you expect. And sometimes, they don't find their way back. I stared at the words for a long time. They weren't angry. They weren't sad. Just true. When Elena returned to collect the paper, she read it quietly and nodded, her eyes soft. "This will mean something to someone," she said. "I hope so. Even if my own family never saw it." That night, as I settled into bed, a strange calmness washed over me. Not happiness. Not acceptance. Something quieter. Something closer to understanding. I looked at the empty chair and instead of pain I felt gratitude. Because waiting meant I still believed in connection. Because longing meant I had loved deeply. Because loneliness, painful as it was, came from a life full of people I cherished. And that is not something every person can say. The next morning, I woke with a soft realization settling gently on my heart. Being forgotten by others does not mean I must forget myself. The following days unfolded with the gentle, predictable rhythm of the place. Hallway lights flicking on at dawn. Coffee carts squeaking softly past open doors. The quiet murmur of nurses greeting each other. The familiar shuffle of residents making their slow journeys toward breakfast. I found myself becoming part of that steady rhythm, slipping into the flow rather than resisting it. There is a strange kind of peace in routine even when it grows from loneliness. One morning I woke earlier than usual and sat by the window. The sky was still dark, holding on to the last shades of night. I watched as the horizon softened, shifting from deep navy to muted purple, then finally to a soft, powdery blue. Sunrise never rushed in this place. It crept. It eased its way into the world, careful not to disturb the quiet. I admired that. I understood it. After breakfast, I asked to be taken to the courtyard again. The cold air met me like an old friend, filling my lungs with something sharp and honest. I settled onto the wooden bench, the same one I had sat on with Hal earlier. A few moments later, I heard the faint whir of wheels against concrete. "Morning, James," Hal said, pulling up beside me. "Morning, Hal." He looked up at the pale winter sky. "Sun's trying its best today." I nodded. "It's enough." We sat in silence for a while, watching a pair of small sparrows hop around the feeder. One fluttered toward us, then quickly retreated, startled by its own boldness. Hal chuckled. "They're braver than we are." I smiled. "In some ways, yes." He hesitated before speaking again. I used to think being alone was the worst thing that could happen to a man at our age. But now, I'm not so sure." I glanced at him. "What changed your mind?" Hal ran a hand along the armrest of his wheelchair, as though searching for the right words. "I realized something. Being alone means you've lived long enough to outlast your losses. It means you've loved enough to feel the emptiness. It means you're still here, still breathing, still hoping, still waiting for something good to happen." His voice softened. "Loneliness is painful, yes. But it's also proof that your heart isn't done yet." I let his words settle in my mind, slow and steady. Maybe that was true. Maybe loneliness wasn't the enemy I thought it was. Maybe it was a reminder that parts of me still longed for connection, and longing itself was a kind of life. After a while, a nurse came to tell us it was time to head in. Hal and I shared a small nod, an unspoken agreement that this quiet companionship mattered. Back in my room, I found myself studying the painting again. Those two silhouettes under that blue sky suddenly felt different. They felt like a promise I had made with a younger version of myself. A reminder that love, once real, leaves an imprint that time cannot wash away. I reached for the photograph of my family. I didn't cry this time. Instead, I spoke softly to the faces frozen in that summer sunlight. "I love you," I whispered. "Even if you can't be here. I still love you." Saying it brought no bitterness, no expectation, just a simple truth settling tenderly on my heart. That afternoon, Elena brought in the community bulletin board for display. Residents gathered around it, pointing at the colorful notes and drawings. There, in the center, was my little message. Love people while they're within reach. Life takes them farther than you expect. And sometimes, they don't find their way back. A few residents paused to read it. One woman pressed her lips together, nodding slowly. A man whispered, "True words." Another placed his hand gently over the corner of the paper, as though holding on to something meaningful. Seeing their reactions sent a soft warmth through me. Maybe I wasn't completely invisible after all. Maybe I still had something to give. Later in the evening, as the sky darkened and the hallway quieted, I sat again in the visitor's chair. Not waiting this time. Not hoping. Just sitting. Breathing. Existing in a space I once feared would swallow me whole. The loneliness was still there, of course it was. But it felt less like a heavy weight and more like a familiar companion. Something I could acknowledge without letting it consume me. I spent that quiet hour thinking about my life. The joys. The regrets. The losses. The unimaginable beauty of small moments. The long stretches of silence that taught me more than noise ever could. I thought about Ruth and how she would tell me, "James, you've always been stronger than you believe." I thought about my children and how life pulled them into their own storms, too far for me to see. I thought about how companionship can come from the unlikeliest places. I thought about every sunrise I had watched, every breath I had taken, every memory that still lived inside me. And in that moment, something gentle rose through me, something that felt like acceptance. Not resignation. Not defeat. Acceptance. A soft understanding that life does not always look the way we planned, but it still holds meaning in the quiet corners. That being remembered is a gift. But remembering, truly remembering, is a skill we carry within us. That connections may fade, but the impact of love never truly leaves. That isolation doesn't mean our story is over. It means we still have time left to fill, even if we fill it differently than we once imagined. As the lights dimmed for the night, I leaned back and closed my eyes. The silence around me felt gentler now, like a soft blanket rather than a cold wall. I whispered into the stillness, letting the words drift into the dim room. I'm still here. I still matter. My story isn't finished yet. And I believed it. Truly believed it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Even in the quietest rooms, even in the loneliest places, our stories still matter. And so do we.